Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the 5th video lecture on OCR A Level Sociology Paper 1, looking at feminism and culture. In the previous lectures, we looked at the difference between conflict and consensus theories of society. Functionalism is a consensus theory that focuses on the things we all share. Marxism is a conflict theory that focuses on what divides us. And feminism is a different conflict theory. Feminism rejects the functionalist idea that society is based around our biological needs, and also that it's based around shared values. Instead, feminism focuses on conflict between the sexes in society. In particular, the idea that women are subordinated, made second-class citizens, compared to men. Feminism identifies society as a patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system that privileges men, gives them all sorts of advantages, and it subordinates women and femaleness generally, making anything feminine out to be inferior. Feminism supports cultural relativism. It likes to point out that the role of women differs greatly from society to society, and this is something that counts as evidence against the idea that there's a biological basis for the role of women in society. There are strongly patriarchal cultures out there, many feminists would say we live in one of them, that subordinate women and which enforce this with threats of violence. We've already seen one piece of sociological research right at the start of the course, Margaret Mead's research in Samoa and New Guinea in the 1920s and 1930s. There were tribes where the women were aggressive and dominant in society compared to the men, and in Samoa, she found a society where young girls had a degree of sexual and social freedom that was unknown in America at that time. Patriarchy, then, is the systematic domination by men and subordination of women. I think the word systematic is important here. Feminists aren't just pointing out that some men are jerks and that some women have a hard time, that society does this as a matter of course. It's not down to a few individuals being unlucky or horrible. It's the way society works. And this takes the form of confining women to what's known as the domestic sphere, the home. So we're talking housework, childcare. As a consequence of this, women are paid less when they do enter the world of paid work. This is known as the gender pay gap. They have restricted opportunities for promotion. This is known as the glass ceiling, a sort of invisible barrier that men can pass through but women can't. And it explains the absence of equal numbers of women in top jobs in society. And then there is physical threat. Feminists point out that there is male violence against women. And this is systematic as well. Even the men who don't carry out the violence, nonetheless, they joke about it and connive in it. This is sometimes referred to as rape culture. We've seen how functionalists praise Western liberal democracies as a rather ideal sort of society, and we've seen how Marxists condemn this sort of society. Feminists also have got deep reservations about Western liberal democracies. These societies came about in the Industrial Revolution, and it was pointed out by Marx's colleague Friedrich Engels that the Industrial Revolution depends on the unpaid labour of women. The men go to the factories to work, but the women are required to work without pay in the home to make that possible. Western liberal democracies are also famously liberal and democracies for men only. Men have a great deal of freedom in these societies. Women are much more restricted. Men vote, and for a long time women couldn't. The vote for women was hard won. Like Marxists, feminists believe in the importance of ideology. Ideology, you will remember, is a package of ideas that circulate in society which hide the unfairness of things so that we don't notice it, and if we do notice it, justify that unfairness as being in some sense natural or inevitable and nothing to get worked up about. For example, feminists would point out that the media puts out images of femininity, in particular images that sexually objectify women, that focus on their bodies, and particularly the sexual appeal of their bodies for men. And this leads to an acceptance of the view that women are only suitable as sexual playmates or as reproducers, as mothers, and not to be valued for their intelligence or other skills. Education also contributes to this ideology, perhaps encouraging the view that certain subjects are feminine subjects and other subjects, perhaps engineering, mathematics, science, are not seen as feminine. It is interesting that the non-feminine subjects tend to be the ones that qualify you for the highest paid jobs. Finally, there's the issue of religion. We're talking here about Judeo-Christian society, a society that comes from the roots of Judaism and Christianity, but many of these points would apply to Islam as well. And this is a religion which represents women as sinful creatures. Eve, after all, is the first sinner whose disobedience corrupts the human race. When women do appear in religious stories, they are either perfect creatures like the Virgin Mary, or else evil and wicked temptresses who lead men astray. Feminism has been characterized by a number of waves, beginning with the first wave of feminism in the 19th century and lasting to the early 20th century. This was very much focused on the right to vote, what is known as women's suffrage. The suffragettes is a very well-known name for these first feminist campaigners. In fact, at the time, it was a satirical name. It was coined by the newspaper The Daily Mail as a rather dismissive term for these feminist campaigners, but it seems to have stuck. The campaign for women's suffrage was successful. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to give women the vote. The USA in 1920, and in 1928 the UK gave all adult women the vote. Other forms of legal equality include owning property, inheriting property, running businesses, going to university, and these were all achievements of the first wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism emerged in the mid-20th century, the 1960s and 1970s in particular. If there's one book that can be credited with starting the second wave of feminism, it would be The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan in 1963. Friedan's book focuses on the unhappiness of so many American housewives. Even though they were living in a time of great wealth, prosperity and security, something was missing from their lives. And Friedan analyses that problem. What's missing was independence, respect, autonomy. The campaigning of second-wave feminists focusing on changing patriarchal culture and ending discrimination had a number of successes. You could point to, in the UK, the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act that made it illegal to discriminate against women in the workplace and elsewhere. There have been other waves of feminism since, third wave, fourth wave feminism, but we'll discuss those a little bit later on in the course. It's also common to split feminism into three broad branches or types. Liberal feminism has a focus on using education, slow and gradual political reform. Many of the changes that have happened to the law, like the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, could be linked to the campaigning of liberal feminists. Radical feminists, that is a branch of feminism much more focused on protest, setting up women-only communities, constructing a way of life for women separate from men. Then there is Marxist feminism. This links patriarchy with capitalism, suggesting that you can't have one without the other, and therefore only by overthrowing capitalism can you overthrow patriarchy. This is a revolutionary form of feminism that dismisses the idea of the sort of gradual reform that liberal feminists look for. What key scholars is it worth knowing about to understand feminism? Right at the very start of the feminist movement, you've got the powerful figure of Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century. She would perhaps best be described as a proto-feminist, somebody who came before the first wave of feminism. Wollstonecraft's groundbreaking book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, was published in 1792. Wollstonecraft famously said, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." And she very much saw education as the key to doing that. Wollstonecraft, incidentally, was the mother of the author Mary Shelley, a pioneer of science fiction writing who wrote Frankenstein. A more recent feminist writer is Anne Oakley, British 20th century feminist who made a big focus on the position of wives and daughters in society. Oakley wrote many books, but we could focus on Conventional Families, 1982, in which he looks at the differences between the way girls and boys are raised, the different clothes they're given, the different toys and games that they're invited to play, the different ways their parents speak to them. She identifies the focus on making young girls grow up to be compliant, obedient, biddable, not cause any trouble. The focus on making them pay attention to their appearance, to be attractive, to be neat and clean and pretty. The focus on women being non-aggressive compared to boys who are encouraged to be outspoken, noisy, physical and reckless. How can we evaluate feminism? Well, as with Marxism, we can praise feminism for its activism. Like Marxism, feminism isn't just trying to understand society, it's trying to change it for the better. Feminism is all about identifying sexism, identifying double standards, identifying where there are worse outcomes for women, and then arguing for social change to put that right. A weakness, though, of feminism could be a biological critique. It would be simply a scientific fact that there are broad but important biological differences between the males and the females in almost every species. Functionalists make this a pretty central idea to their whole view of society. It's perfectly possible that these biological differences could lead men and women to have different priorities and different preferences. An awful lot of what feminists point to in society as unfairness might be a sort of inevitable consequence of biological differences that nobody can do anything about. However, we must be careful here. Saying that something is based on biology and therefore you can't do anything about it might also risk justifying male violence. And it follows, therefore, that even if there are biological differences between males and females, feminists might still be right to argue that we should construct society to be more fair to both sexes. Let's summarise. Feminism is the belief that in society there is systematic domination by men and the subordination of women. They term this arrangement patriarchy. The first wave in the 19th century, which led to women's suffrage, the vote, and to legal equality in many areas of life, and the second wave in the 1960s and 70s that challenged sexism and discrimination that still existed in society and brought about many changes to the law to put an end to them. Feminism has a critical view of traditional institutions. It sees them as, for the most part, deeply sexist, deeply patriarchal, and it opposes traditional views about gender and the family, which it sees as leading to the subordination of women. Let's look at some exam questions involving feminism. As with functionalism and as with Marxism, there's perhaps unlikely to be a direct question about feminism in Section A, but feminism could come into your answer, particularly your answer to the 20-mark question, question 3. Look at this one. Outline and briefly evaluate the view that culture is changing in modern Britain. What would feminists say to evaluate that? Well, some feminists, liberal feminists might point out that there have been changes in British culture, changes that make this culture less discriminatory towards women and more equal. And they might point out things like the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act as a great achievement in making a more equal society. But other feminists, perhaps particularly radical and Marxist feminists, would say that this is very little change and certainly not enough change, and they would say that British culture is still deeply patriarchal in many ways. The other question is outline and briefly evaluate the view that cultural relativism is helpful for understanding society. Feminists would evaluate this by saying, yes, it's very helpful. If we can look at other societies where gender roles are different, perhaps more equal, then that can help us see that our own society's gender roles are socially constructed. In other words, they don't have to be that way. It gives us greater confidence in changing them. Another question is outline and briefly evaluate the view that norms in British society are changing. An awful lot of norms in society are sexist, everything from calling male teachers sir and female teachers miss, to the different dress codes for men and women, and the tendency for women to take on their husband's name when they get married. Some of these norms are certainly changing, and many women keep their own names when they get married, for example. However, these norms still continue for the majority of people. So once again, we can say that some feminists would see that there's been a huge amount of progress here, but other feminists would see society is still dominated by patriarchal norms. The final question asks you to outline and briefly evaluate the view that values in British society are shared by most people. Again, feminists here would make a point similar to Marxists, that yes, there are deeply sexist and patriarchal values that are held in society by most people and are spread by, for example, religion and the media. And that many women themselves share those values, even though those values make them second-class citizens. This is brought about by a patriarchal ideology. Well, I hope that has been a helpful overview of feminism and culture. You can find more about this in my study guide, Socialisation, Culture and Identity, available on Amazon, and the combined study guide with youth subcultures on Amazon, and the link is in the description below. The next video lecture will be on types of culture. See you then. Sociology Robot.